What if I told you that a single habit could rewrite your destiny? In today's story, a tiny sparrow, weak, hopeless, trapped in the desert, learned one simple practice that turned 10 years of suffering into freedom. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of burning sand beneath a merciless sun. Waves of heat shimmered in the air, making the horizon dance like a cruel mirage. The ground was cracked and lifeless, the kind of place where even the strongest of creatures would struggle to survive. Yet in this barren wasteland, a tiny sparrow still clung to life. Her feathers were thin and ragged, many already fallen away. Her wings, once built for flight, now hung limp and powerless. She hopped weakly across the sand, searching for even the smallest seed, a drop of water, a reason to go on. But every day brought only disappointment, and every night brought the kind of silence that presses on the heart like a weight. Alone, fragile, and weary, the sparrow often wondered why she had been spared at all. Why am I still alive, she thought, if each moment only brings more pain? She remembered what it felt like to soar through the air, to feel the wind beneath her wings, but those memories now seemed like distant dreams. Her present reality was nothing but suffering. One afternoon, as the sun reached its cruelest height, she dragged herself beneath the small shadow of a rock. The shade was barely enough to shield her from the burning rays, but it was all she had. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, and her voice cracked with thirst. The thought crossed her mind again. If this is life, then what is the point of living? Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. Just as despair was about to swallow her whole, the sparrow noticed movement far in the distance. A faint figure appeared, wavering in the shimmering air. At first she thought it was another mirage, a trick of the desert heat. But slowly, step by step, the figure came closer. It was no illusion. It was a traveler. As the outline grew sharper, she could see a young monk, dressed simply, his sandals coated in dust. Though his steps were heavy from the long journey, his face carried a quiet calm, as if each footstep was guided by something greater. His robe fluttered lightly in the dry wind, and even in the lifeless desert, he seemed to carry a presence of peace. The sparrow felt a faint spark of hope flicker inside her fragile chest. With the last of her strength, she let out a trembling call. "Ah, traveler, where are you going?" The monk stopped in his tracks. His eyes softened as he spotted the frail bird huddled in the shade. His heart melted at the sight of her suffering. He walked closer, knelt beside her, and for a moment, the harsh desert felt less cruel. The young monk smiled gently and said, "I am on a journey to meet my master. He lives on the far side of this desert, a man of great wisdom. But tell me, little one, what are you doing here, and how have you reached such a miserable state?" The sparrow lowered her head, ashamed, and whispered, in a voice barely audible, "I suffer because of my fate. I am weak. I cannot fly. I have no food, no water, no home. Every day feels like a curse. Please, tell me, when will my suffering end?" The desert wind carried her words away, but the pain in her tone was heavy enough to reach the monk's soul. He placed his hand over his chest, knowing he could not answer on his own. With a gentle nod, he replied, "I cannot tell you now, but I promise this. When I return from my master, I will bring you the answer." The sparrow's eyes glistened with a fragile hope. She whispered weakly, "Then I will wait for you." And with that, the monk stood and continued his journey, his figure slowly disappearing once more into the vast horizon. Alone again, the sparrow tucked herself into the tiny shadow, waiting, wondering what destiny might hold. The desert is not kind to travelers. By the time the young monk reached the halfway mark of his journey, sweat had soaked through his robe and dust clung to his skin like a second layer. Yet, unlike most wanderers who might curse the blazing sun or the endless sand, his steps carried a strange serenity. Every movement was deliberate, as if each grain of sand he crossed was part of a greater lesson. Behind him lay miles of barren earth. Ahead stretched more of the same, but within him there was peace. He knew his destination, the humble dwelling of his master, a man whose wisdom was said to turn storms into silence, whose words could change not just lives, but hearts. As he walked, the young monk's thoughts drifted back to the frail voice he had heard earlier, the little sparrow hidden in the shadow of a rock. That voice still echoed in his ears. When will my suffering end? The weight of that question pressed heavy on him. He had offered her hope, a promise to return with an answer, but the truth was, he did not know if he could keep it. The monk had seen suffering before. He had walked through villages struck by drought, where children cried out for water that never came. He had prayed with the sick and comforted the grieving. But never had he seen such raw desperation in something so small and helpless as that sparrow. He remembered the way she trembled when she spoke, the way her wings lay flat against her sides, useless, as if life itself had abandoned them. There had been no anger in her eyes, no blame cast toward the heavens, only exhaustion, fear, and the haunting question, why must I live like this? The monk tightened his grip on his staff. I must ask the master, he thought. She deserves an answer. By late evening, the horizon finally shifted. The endless dunes gave way to a scattering of rocky hills. Among them stood a modest stone cottage, weathered by wind, but steady, like its owner. Outside, a small lantern flickered, casting a warm glow against the growing twilight. The monk bowed deeply before stepping inside. The air smelled faintly of sage and old parchment. His master sat cross-legged on a mat, his eyes closed, his breathing slow and even. He did not stir at the sound of footsteps. It was as though he had already known his disciple was coming. The monk lowered himself to his knees. "Master," he said softly, "on my way here I met a sparrow living in great misery. Her feathers are gone, her wings cannot fly, and she has no food, no water, no shelter. She asked me when her suffering would end. I could not answer. Can you tell me what fate awaits her?" Silence filled the small room. The only sound was the faint whistle of the desert wind, slipping through cracks in the stone. The master remained motionless, eyes closed, as though listening not to his disciple, but to something deeper, something beyond. The monk waited. Minutes felt like hours. His heart raced, torn between reverence and desperation. Finally, the master opened his eyes. 10 more years of hardship lie ahead, he said, his voice calm, almost detached, as if reciting a truth written in stone. The young monk's heart sank. 10 years? The words struck him like a blow. He pictured the sparrow, fragile and trembling, waiting beneath her tiny rock for hope. 10 years would not bring her salvation. it would destroy her. She could barely endure 10 more days, let alone 10 long years. "Master," he pleaded, his voice unsteady. "If I tell her this, it will break her spirit completely. How can she survive such a sentence?" The old man finally turned his gaze toward his disciple, his eyes sharp yet kind, like the desert sky at dawn. He placed a weathered hand on the young monk's shoulder. "Yes," he said, "10 years are written, but fate is not iron. There is a way." The monk leaned forward, hope flickering in his chest. "Please, master, tell me." The master's voice was gentle, but each word carried weight. "Tell her this, whatever happens, no matter how thirsty, how weak, how lonely she feels, she must give thanks with all her heart. Gratitude will not erase her pain, but it will shield her from drowning in it. Gratitude can burn away the chains of old suffering and open the path to change." The monk closed his eyes, letting the words settle. Gratitude. It seemed so simple, yet he had seen its power before. He had watched widows who, in their sorrow, still gave thanks for love once shared. He had met farmers who, after losing crops, still thanked the earth for giving them another season. Gratitude did not change the storm, but it changed the heart, facing the storm. When he opened his eyes again, the master had returned to silence, his expression unreadable. The conversation was, "Oh, monk," she cried weakly, "what did your master say about me?" The monk hesitated. He felt the weight of two truths, the cruelty of 10 years and the hope of gratitude. For a moment, he struggled, torn between honesty and mercy. Then he knelt beside her, his voice soft. "My master said that if nothing changes, 10 more years of hardship lie ahead." The sparrow froze. Her tiny body shook, and tears welled in her tired eyes. 10 more years? I cannot survive even 10 more days like this. The monk reached out gently, his tone steady, though his heart ached. "Do not lose hope, little one. The master also gave me a way. He said that no matter what happens, you must give thanks. Gratitude, spoken with a true heart, can lighten the heaviest burdens. It may not make sense now, but it can change what lies ahead." ... The sparrow trembled in silence, her eyes searching his face for some proof, some reason to believe. Finally, she whispered, almost to herself, "I don't understand, but I will try." And with that quiet promise, the seed of transformation was planted. The desert always seemed endless on the return journey. The monk's sandals pressed into the scorching sand, his robe tugged by the dry wind. But his mind was heavier than his body. Every step carried the weight of the master's words. 10 more years of hardship. He replayed the moment over and over in his mind. The silence before the answer, the stillness in the master's face. And then that stark sentence, delivered without hesitation, without pity. The master had spoken truth as he saw it, but truth could be sharper than any blade. The monk's chest tightened. How could he deliver such a verdict to the sparrow? He had looked into her eyes, seen the despair already gnawing at her tiny spirit. She had clung to hope like a drowning soul clings to driftwood, waiting for him to return with salvation. To tell her that salvation was still 10 years away felt like cruelty. But he also carried something more than despair. He carried the second half of the master's message, the way out, gratitude. It sounded so small, so fragile, and yet the master's tone had been unwavering, certain. Gratitude was not a mere suggestion. It was a force, a weapon against despair. The monk clenched his staff and whispered to himself, as though practicing the words he would soon have to say. Tell her that fate bends before a grateful heart. By the time the monk reached the familiar rock, the sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows across the sand. The sparrow was there, exactly where he had left her, though even weaker than before. Her feathers looked thinner, her eyes dimmer, and yet when she saw him, a flicker of light returned to her gaze. She called out, her voice trembling but eager, "O monk, what did your master say about me? When will my suffering end?" The monk's breath caught in his throat. For a long moment he said nothing. He knelt beside her, lowering himself to her level. He could see the hope in her eyes, fragile as glass, and he knew that one careless word could shatter it. Finally, he spoke, his tone soft, deliberate. "My master said, if nothing changes, your suffering may last for 10 more years." The words struck like a thunderclap. The sparrow froze, her small body trembling. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, 10 years? I cannot live even 10 more days like this. 10 years will kill me. The monk's own heart ached at her despair. He reached out, placing his hand gently against the warm sand, close enough for her to feel his presence, but not to frighten her. "Do not lose hope, little one. My master also gave me a way to change what is written." The sparrow blinked, barely able to lift her head. "Change what is written?" "Yes," the monk replied firmly. "Fate may be heavy, but it is not carved in stone. My master said this: no matter what happens, whether you are hungry, thirsty, weak, or alone, you must give thanks. Gratitude spoken from the heart can lighten the weight of suffering and open the path to change." The sparrow tilted her head, confusion and doubt mixing with fear. "Give thanks? For what? For hunger? For thirst? For pain?" The monk nodded. "Yes, even for those. Gratitude does not deny suffering. It transforms the heart carrying it. When you give thanks, you no longer drown in despair. Instead, you rise above it, and when your heart rises, life begins to shift around you." Silence hung between them. The sparrow lowered her gaze, wrestling with the words. It made no sense. How could saying thank you to a merciless world possibly change anything? And yet, she saw the calm in the monk's face, the steady fire in his eyes. He believed it, and something inside her wanted to believe too. At last, in a voice so faint it was almost lost to the wind, she whispered, "I don't understand, but I will try." The monk allowed a gentle smile to touch his lips. He bowed his head, as though honoring her courage, however small. "That is enough," he said. "Trying is the first step. The rest will follow." That night, as the monk continued his journey back toward his master's cottage, the desert sky unfolded in a sea of stars. He looked upward and whispered a silent prayer, not to change the sparrow's fate, but to give her the strength to practice what she had promised. Meanwhile, beneath the rock's meager shade, the sparrow lay awake. The master's prophecy still echoed in her ears. 10 more years. The weight of it crushed her spirit. But then she remembered the monk's words. Gratitude can bend fate. Weakly, she drew in a breath and whispered into the night, "Thank you for this breath." The words felt strange, almost foolish, but as they left her beak, she felt the tiniest spark of warmth flicker in her chest. She didn't know if it would change anything, but for the first time, she had something other than despair to hold on to. And so, the first seed of gratitude was planted. The night after hearing the prophecy stretched longer than any the sparrow had ever known. Darkness pressed down on the desert, and the air turned cold. Yet sleep would not come. The words echoed endlessly in her mind. 10 more years of suffering. She lay still under the rock's frail shadow, her body trembling not from the cold, but from fear. 10 years was not time. It was a sentence, a chain she could never carry. How can I last 10 more days, let alone 10 more years? She whispered into the silence. A bitter thought crept in. Perhaps it would be better if she did not wake at all. Perhaps the desert would swallow her in the night, and her suffering would finally end. When dawn arrived, the sparrow's eyes burned with exhaustion. She tried to stretch her wings, but they were too weak. She tried to peck at the sand, but there was nothing. The sun rose higher, merciless as always, and despair weighed heavier than the heat. By mid-morning, the young monk returned to check on her. From a distance, he saw her lying motionless, and for a moment, he feared she had already given up. Rushing forward, he knelt beside her. "Little one," he said softly, "do not surrender." The sparrow lifted her head weakly, her voice broken. "You do not understand. Your master said 10 years. I cannot carry such a burden. My spirit is already broken." The monk lowered his eyes. He felt the sharp sting of guilt. He had spoken the truth, yet truth alone had crushed her. He remembered the look in his master's eyes, a gaze that balanced compassion with challenge. The master had known this moment would come. That was why he had given not only prophecy, but remedy. Taking a deep breath, the monk leaned closer. "Listen to me. Fate can feel like a prison, but it is not unbreakable. My master said there is one way forward: gratitude. No matter what happens, give thanks, even if your body is weak. Your heart can still be strong." The sparrow shook her head. "Gratitude? For what? For thirst that burns my throat? For the emptiness in my belly? For wings that cannot lift me?" "Yes," the monk said firmly, but with gentleness. "Even for those. Gratitude does not erase pain. It changes the heart that carries it. And when the heart changes, life begins to shift. You may not understand today. You may not even believe it. But if you try, you will discover strength you never knew you had." The sparrow closed her eyes, letting the words wash over her. She wanted to dismiss them, to call them foolish. But something in the monk's tone made her pause. It was not pity. It was conviction. That afternoon, the desert grew hotter, and the sparrow's despair deepened. At one point, she struggled to her feet, determined to fly away from her misery, even if it meant collapsing in the attempt. She beat her wings with all the strength she had left. For a moment, her body lifted an inch above the sand, but only for a moment. She fell, hitting the ground hard, feathers scattering. The impact stole what little hope remained. She lay there, eyes shut tight, whispering, "I am useless. I am cursed." The monk rushed to her side, his heart aching. He wanted to lift her, to carry her to safety, but he knew he could not interfere with her choice. Transformation had to come from within. Still, he knelt in the sand beside her, his voice calm but urgent. "Listen to me, little one. Your suffering is real, but so is your chance to rise. Do not wait for the desert to change. Begin here with your own heart. Say it, thank you, not because you feel it. The words will guide the heart, and the heart will guide your life. The sparrow turned her head weakly, eyes filled with tears. Thank you for this pain? Yes, the monk whispered, his eyes steady. For this moment, because even in pain, you are alive, and while you are alive, change is possible. Silence followed. The sparrow wanted to resist, to argue, to reject the idea. Yet something stirred deep inside her, something she couldn't quite name. A tiny flicker of courage, perhaps, or maybe the faintest whisper of hope. She closed her eyes, drew in a shallow breath, and let the words slip out. Thank you for this breath. The monk's lips curved into a quiet smile. Yes, that is enough. One step, one word, the beginning. That night, the sparrow lay beneath the stars. The prophecy still haunted her, but alongside it lived something new. The despair had not vanished, but it no longer stood alone. It now shared space with the faintest ember of gratitude. For the first time in a long time, the sparrow did not fall asleep asking, "Why me?" She fell asleep whispering, "Thank you for today." And though the desert remained the same, within her, something had begun to change. The first day after the monk left, the sparrow sat in silence beneath her rock. Her body ached, her throat was dry, and her stomach cried for food. Every part of her wanted to complain, to curse the heavens, to ask again, "Why me?" But then she remembered his words. Say thank you, not because you feel it, but because you choose it. At first it seemed absurd. Gratitude for pain. Gratitude for hunger. She wanted to scoff at the thought. Yet somewhere inside, she knew she had little left to lose. And so, with a trembling breath, she whispered, "Thank you for this shade, small as it is." The words were quiet, almost embarrassed. But as they left her beak, she felt something shift. Not in the desert, not in the cruel sun or the burning sand, but in herself. For the first time in days, her chest felt a little lighter. That evening, as the stars appeared, the sparrow whispered again, "Thank you for the stars that keep me company." The desert was still cold, still unforgiving, but somehow the loneliness felt a little less sharp. The next morning, when the heat returned, she dragged herself out from the rock's shadow. The ground was blistering, and each step stung her tiny feet. She winced, but then remembered. Gratitude. With effort, she said, "Thank you, even for this heat, because it means I am still alive." Days passed. Nothing in the desert seemed to change, and yet everything inside her began to. When a single drop of dew formed on a leaf at dawn, she whispered, "Thank you for this drop of life." When a seed rolled across the sand, carried by the wind, she whispered, "Thank you for this gift." When her wings ached with every stretch, she whispered, "Thank you, because pain means I can still feel." The words did not erase her hunger, but they gave her strength to endure it. They did not make the desert bloom overnight, but they made her heart bloom in small ways. As she continued this strange practice, something subtle began to happen. She noticed things she had never seen before. The cracks in the earth sometimes hid tiny insects. The dry bushes, once invisible, still carried seeds if she searched carefully. Even the wind, though harsh, sometimes brought the faint smell of water from far away. Gratitude had not changed the desert, but it had opened her eyes. Each day, she whispered thanks. Each day, she found something, no matter how small, to be grateful for. And little by little, she began to feel stronger. One morning, as the sun rose red across the horizon, the sparrow stretched her wings. For weeks they had been useless, fragile, weak. But now, though still thin, they carried a hint of strength. She flapped once, twice. A small feather loosened and floated to the ground. But beside it, another feather pushed its way out, new and full of color. The sparrow froze. She looked at the new feather, her heart racing. Was this real? Could gratitude truly breathe life back into what had been lost? Tears welled in her eyes, and for the first time, they were not tears of sorrow. She lifted her face to the sky and whispered, "Thank you for this gift of hope." From that day forward, the changes came slowly but steadily. A few more feathers grew. Her voice became stronger, her hops across the sand less weary. She even found herself singing again. A faint song at first, but then louder. The desert still raged around her. The sun still scorched, the nights still chilled. Yet inside her, there was a new song, a new rhythm, a strength she had never known. Gratitude had not erased her hardships, but it had given her a way to survive them. Weeks passed. The monk had not yet returned, but the sparrow no longer counted the days in misery. She counted them in whispers of thanks. Thank you for this breath. Thank you for this tiny seed. Thank you for today. Each thank you was like a small stone, laid one by one, forming a path out of despair. And though the desert remained vast, for the first time she felt she was walking a road instead of wandering aimlessly. One night, as she settled beneath the stars, she thought back to her question, "When will my suffering end?" She realized something unexpected. Though her body was still weak, the suffering inside her heart had already begun to fade. What had once felt unbearable was now endurable. What had once felt like punishment now felt like a challenge. She smiled, closing her eyes. Gratitude had not taken away her hardships, but it had given her back her life. And in that moment, without even realizing it, the prophecy had already begun to bend. The desert is not known for mercy, but sometimes even the harshest lands yield to change. Weeks had passed since the sparrow first began whispering her thanks into the wind. By now, her feathers had grown back in patches, soft and new. Her wings still felt fragile, but each day they grew stronger. And though hunger still gnawed at her belly, she noticed that her heart no longer carried the same weight of despair. Then one morning, the sky shifted. The horizon, usually blinding with endless sunlight, carried a strange darkness. Heavy clouds gathered above, thick and full, their edges glowing with lightning. The sparrow looked upward in awe. She had almost forgotten what clouds looked like. The wind rose, stronger than usual, swirling the sand into spirals. It was wild, almost violent, but the sparrow didn't shrink from it. She pressed her claws into the earth and whispered, "Thank you for this wind. Thank you for the promise of change." Moments later, the first drop of rain struck the ground. Then another, and another. Within minutes, the desert, once silent and lifeless, was filled with the sound of falling water. The sparrow opened her beak, catching the cool drops, and her throat, dry for so long, was soothed. She laughed, a sound that surprised even her. "Thank you," she cried, lifting her wings as the rain soaked her feathers. "Thank you for this gift." The rain poured for hours, seeping into the cracked earth. What had been barren sand began to soften, darken, and then sprout with life. Tiny shoots of green appeared, delicate but determined, as if the land itself had been waiting for this moment. By the next morning, the desert no longer looked the same. Patches of grass pushed upward, wildflowers bloomed in unexpected places, and a shallow pool of water had formed in a dip in the land. The sparrow hopped to the water's edge, dipped her beak, and drank deeply. The coolness filled her body like life itself flowing back into her. Seeds and insects appeared where none had been before, and for the first time in countless days, the sparrow ate until her belly was full. But the greatest change was not in the land. It was in her wings. With food, water, and renewed strength, her feathers grew in fully, sleek and strong. She stretched them wide, marveling at how they caught the wind. Tentatively, she flapped once, twice. Then, with a rush of air, she lifted off the ground. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she was flying. The sky, once unreachable, now embraced her. She soared above the blooming desert, droplets of rain still clinging to her feathers, sparkling in the sunlight. She sang as she flew, her voice no longer weak and broken, but clear and strong, echoing across the once barren land. "Thank you," she cried, her song ringing with joy. "Thank you for this life, for this chance, for this sky." As days turned into weeks, the desert transformed further. What had been a place of death became a place of life. Plants grew, water collected, and animals began to return. The sparrow was no longer alone. Other birds joined her, drawn to the new oasis. What had once been silence was now filled with chirps, rustles, and the sound of life. The sparrow perched on a flowering branch, watching the world around her. She remembered the days of hopelessness, the endless thirst, the prophecy of 10 long years. And yet here she was, alive, thriving, free. She closed her eyes and whispered one more time, "Thank you for everything, for the suffering that led me here, and for the gratitude that gave me wings again." Far away, the young monk was making his way back across the desert. His steps were quicker now, eager to return to the spot where he had first met the little sparrow. He wondered if she had survived. He feared he might find only silence, an empty shadow beneath the rock. But as he neared the place, he heard singing. A clear, joyful song carried on the wind. Looking up, he saw her, flying high, her feathers bright, circling above a land no longer barren, but blooming. His eyes widened in wonder. "It's impossible," he whispered. "The master said 10 more years. How could this change come so soon?" The sparrow swooped down, landing on a branch near him. She chirped happily, her eyes shining with life. The monk laughed in amazement. For a moment, he simply watched her, unable to believe the miracle before him. That night, when he returned to his master, the young monk could hardly contain himself. "Master, you told me the sparrow had 10 more years of suffering, but in only a few weeks, her life has transformed. She flies again. She thrives. How can this be?" The old master smiled faintly, as though he had expected this question. His voice was calm, steady. "Yes, 10 years of sorrow were written. But gratitude changes the heart. And when the heart changes, fate bends." She did not erase her suffering. She transformed it. Gratitude burned away what chained her, and in that freedom, life itself bloomed. The monk bowed his head, humbled. He understood now. Destiny was not unshakable. A grateful heart could change even the most desolate desert into a garden. And in the desert, under a sky now alive with stars, the sparrow sang her song of thanks, her wings carrying her higher than she had ever flown before. The young monk returned to his master's cottage with urgency in his steps, his heart pounding with disbelief and awe. When he arrived, he bowed low, his voice trembling with excitement. "Master," he said, "I do not understand. You told me the sparrow's suffering would last 10 more years. But in only a few weeks, she is flying again. The desert has bloomed, water has returned, and she sings with joy. How can this be? How can what was written in destiny change so quickly?" The old master's eyes softened. He closed them for a moment, as if listening to a truth that came not from words, but from silence itself. Then he spoke, each syllable measured, calm and clear. Yes, 10 years of sorrow were written in her path, but she found the key I gave her. Gratitude does not erase suffering. It transforms the one who suffers. When the heart truly gives thanks, the chains of pain loosen. The sparrow's gratitude shifted her spirit, and her spirit reshaped her destiny. What was meant to crush her became the soil for her strength. The young monk bowed deeply, humbled by the wisdom. He realized then that destiny was not a cage, but a mirror, reflecting the heart that faced it. Far away, in the oasis that had once been nothing but sand, the sparrow perched on a blossoming branch. She looked out over the land that had been her prison, now turned into her home. The air was filled with the scent of flowers, the murmur of water, and the chorus of other birds that had returned. She stretched her wings, still marveling at their strength. Each feather felt like a gift, each breath a miracle. She remembered the nights of despair, the prophecy of 10 long years, and how close she had come to surrendering to death. But she had chosen, instead, to whisper thanks. One fragile thank you at a time, she had built a bridge from misery to hope. And that bridge had carried her here, to life, to freedom, to flight. She lifted her head to the sky and sang a song, not just of joy, but of gratitude. It was a song for the pain that had taught her endurance, a song for the hunger that had taught her to notice every gift, a song for the loneliness that had taught her the value of connection, a song for the desert itself, which had forced her to discover her own strength. Thank you, her song cried out into the open sky. Thank you for everything. The narrator's voice returns, drawing the listener closer. The story of the sparrow and the monk is not just a tale of survival. It is a mirror of our own lives. Each of us will walk through deserts, seasons when everything feels dry, empty, and hopeless. We may lose our strength, our confidence, even our will to go on. And in those moments, like the sparrow, we may ask, "Why me? When will this suffering end?" But the Master's wisdom carries a truth we too often forget. Complaining does not end pain. It multiplies it. Gratitude does not erase struggle, but it transforms how we face it. And that change, small at first, has the power to open doors we never imagined. The sparrow did not gain her wings back in a single day. She gained them through 1,000 whispers of thanks, spoken into a desert that seemed not to care. But slowly her heart grew lighter, her vision sharper, her strength renewed. And when her heart changed, her world changed with it. Life does not become easier when circumstances improve. Life changes when our perspective does. Gratitude is not about denying pain. It is about choosing not to let pain define us. It is about finding the hidden blessings in hardship, about holding on to hope when all else seems lost. When we give thanks, even in difficulty, our hearts open to possibilities. We stop focusing only on what is missing and start noticing what remains. And often, it is in those moments that miracles take root. Not because the world suddenly changes, but because we have changed the way we walk through it. The sparrow's song reminds us all, deserts can bloom, burdens can lighten, and broken wings can fly again. Not because fate erases our struggles, but because gratitude transforms them into strength. So the next time life feels like an endless desert, remember the sparrow. Whisper thanks, even if your voice trembles. One thank you at a time, you may find that what was once unbearable becomes the very thing that carries you into the sky. And with that, the story closes, not on despair, but on flight. The little sparrow soars above the desert, her wings spread wide, her song carried by the wind. A reminder: if this story touched your heart, don't let it end here. Tap the like button to help it reach more people who might need this message today. Share it with a friend going through a hard time. Sometimes one story is all it takes to spark hope. And I want to hear from you. What's one thing you're grateful for right now, even if life feels heavy? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and your answer might inspire someone else. Finally, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon. Tomorrow's story is one you won't want to miss. It's about how an ordinary man turned his darkest moment into his greatest strength. Your support keeps this channel alive and helps us bring more inspiring stories to you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And above all, thank you for believing in the power of gratitude.